This lecture is entitled Late Antiquity, 350 to 600 AD. As we saw in our previous lectures, the Roman Empire in the West, or in Europe, ended in 476 AD when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by a group of Germans who placed their own leader, Odoacer, on the throne of Rome. After this, a series of Germanic kingdoms replaced the Western Roman Empire. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, however, continued intact with its capital at Constantinople. You'll remember from a previous lecture that Constantinople was founded around the 300s AD by the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine, and he named his city Constantinople for himself. As we saw in a previous lecture, Constantinople was built on the ruins of an old Greek city called Byzantium. Therefore, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, is called the Byzantine Empire. This part of the empire, the eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, would last until 1453. The history of Western civilization is broken into three overall periods, or what historians called schema. And these three schema, or three parts of Western civilization, are the ancient, the medieval, and the modern eras. We have now finished our look at the ancient world, which started with the first civilization of Mesopotamia and ended with the last classical civilization of Rome. Now, for the remainder of this term, we will be focusing on the medieval period, which is Europe from about 500 or shortly after the fall of the Western or European part of the Roman Empire until about 1500 AD. The modern era, 1500 to the present, is the focus of History 102. So, to recap here, the collapse of the Western or European portion of the Roman Empire in 476 AD was the beginning of the so-called medieval period. The word medieval is a Latin word that comes from the combination really of two separate Latin words, medium aevum, which means the Middle Ages. So the medieval period is also sometimes referred to as the Middle Ages. Also, we'll note that traditionally the Middle Ages or medieval period has been called the Dark Ages because some historians have seen the period from 500 to 1500 AD as a period that is characterized by warfare and lack of cultural and artistic development in comparison to the ancient world. But that idea that the period from 500 to 1500 is a period that was backwards or lacking cultural, artistic, technological advancement has fallen out of favor. So you will rarely hear today modern historians, contemporary historians referring to the medieval period as the Dark Ages. That has fallen out of favor. These descriptions, medieval, Middle Ages, Dark Ages, can be used interchangeably to describe the period from 500 to 1500 in Western history. We will call it the medieval period largely, sometimes the Middle Ages. The most important aspects or trends or developments of the medieval period are the rise and domination of the Catholic Church over political, social, and all cultural aspects of this period. The rise of Germanic peoples who had been kept at bay by the power and might of the Roman Empire are suddenly freed, and they establish kingdoms throughout Europe. This is the birth of Europe as we know it. We also see in this period a shifting of settlements from the Mediterranean Sea to northern Europe, In other words, it's no longer Southern Europe, Greece, and Italy, which are the dominant powers, will now be Northern Europe, places like France and what we think of today as Germany and England. Those areas rise in importance in the medieval period. We'll also see the preservation of Greco-Roman or classical culture by the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire. And one last development to mention here, it is also in this period that Islam develops. And we'll talk a bit about Islam later in this lecture. So what we want to look at in this first part of our lecture, now that I've just given you a brief overview of the period 500 to 1500, known as the Middle Ages, what we want to focus in on for just a few minutes is the Byzantine Empire, which we can say lasted from circa around about the founding of Constantinople by Constantine around the year 300 to the final defeat of the Byzantines in 1453 by the Muslims. One of the most important figures in the Byzantine Empire was the Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565. Just to give you a piece of useless information here, Justinian shocked everyone in the Byzantine Empire by his choice of wife. He married a theater performer, an actress more or less, and it's something that you all may never have heard before, but throughout history, actors and performers were regarded as almost inferior individuals, morally suspect people that everyone else enjoyed watching perform but thought of as being inferior, almost at the level of slave. In fact, it was common in Greece and in Rome that when a performer, a theater performer, died, an actor or an actress, he or she would be taken to just a dump on the edge of town and left there to rot away. There was no real burial that was provided for actors and actresses, and that was the case really in some countries until very recently. Even a country that we think of as being very artistic and cultural, like France, also regarded its performers in a very low light until very recently. It was common for actors and actresses in the late 1800s to be abandoned in trash heaps when their dead bodies were found. So anyhow, Justinian had married an actress who also was known for her promiscuity, and so he had somewhat of a questionable marriage partner. Many people regarded his wife Theodora as being inferior, morally corrupt, a bit of a loose woman, so to speak. Justinian's claim to fame as the emperor of the Byzantine Empire is that he attempted to reunite the eastern and western halves of the old Roman Empire. However, this proved to be too expensive and too hard to do. More or less, Justinian tried to bring the two halves together through a combination of diplomacy and warfare, but it was so expensive, such a huge area to try to maintain, and he was having problems with invaders of his own that he more or less had to turn his back on the old Roman Empire. He had to give up the idea of bringing those two halves together. He had to preserve what he owned rather than trying to add to it. So once Justinian turned his back on the old western half of the Roman Empire, he focused in on making the eastern half better in progress, in making the Byzantine Empire an even better place for its citizens. So he reformed the law code left over from ancient Rome. In his Corpus Juris Civilis, he codified the law of ancient Rome and simplified it. He also turned away from Latin and made Greek the official language. And we see at this time the early Christian church developing differently in the Byzantine Empire than it is in the western part of Europe. And so this eastern branch of Christianity eventually becomes known as Greek Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy. Essentially, Roman Catholicism, which was the first branch of Christianity, and Greek Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodox share more things in common about beliefs, protocol, and procedures than they are dissimilar. So, the most notable contributions of the Byzantines in this early period were architecture and military tactics. One of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed is the Hagia Sophia, or Church of Holy Wisdom. Today, that church is no longer a Greek Orthodox or Christian church. It has been converted into a mosque for Muslims, because today Turkey, which is where Constantinople is now a Muslim country. So the Byzantines turn their back and lose interest in the West. And when that happens, the role of the Christian church and the so-called popes in Western Europe become extremely important. So let's start here by saying about the word Catholic. That Catholic is Latin and it means universal, single, or one. The Catholic Church was the one and only church for Christians until 1054. In 1054 AD, the Christians or Roman Catholics in the Byzantine Empire officially broke away from the Christian Church in the West, and this is called the Great Schism or Great Split of 1054. And in 1054, Greek Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy officially becomes a separate church. So it is important to note in our discussion that from this point forward, from 350 until 1500, there's only one Christian church that exists in the West for Christians. A Christian in this period was a Roman Catholic. There was nothing else. It was the one and only church. We can use the terms Christian or Catholic interchangeably in this period. So, Christianity, you might remember, was persecuted under the mad Caesars, legalized by the first Christian Roman Emperor Constantine in 313 with the Edict of Milan, and the Emperor Theodosius the Great made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. So, as the Roman Empire in the West was waning or declining, the importance of the heads of the Roman Catholic or Christian Church, who were called papas or pope. That's Latin for father or papa. So the fathers, the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church, were centered in Rome. Since Rome was the political capital of the old Roman Empire, it made sense that the religious capital should also be in Rome. So the early leaders of the Christian Church or Catholic Church oversaw Roman Catholicism from the capital city of Rome. As Rome begins to decline politically, the Roman Catholic heads of church, the popes, increased in power. As the emperors in the West lost power, lost their ability to sustain Rome against periods of invasion, which we talked about at the end of our discussion of the fall of Rome and in our chapter 6 discussion. Basically, as Rome begins to decline, these Roman Catholic leaders, these popes, step in to try to provide some sense of stability, some sort of leadership in uncertain times. And when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by the Germans, the popes from that point forward stepped in to fill the political void that was left by the lack of an emperor. So what we see is that these Roman Catholic heads of church go from being just spiritual leaders to political leaders inside the city of Rome, until we see, and we'll talk about this in a later lecture, until we see the reign of a French king named Charlemagne in the 800s. What we're going to see happening starting around 500 for about 300 years is that the Byzantine emperors like Justinian try to give political support and leadership to the western half of the Roman Empire through the popes of the Catholic Church. So essentially, these Byzantine emperors attempt to oversee the western half of the old Roman Empire from their capital of Constantinople. They use the popes as their representatives in Rome. So when these popes in the early medieval period get a little taste of power, as we'll see, they're going to be reluctant to give up that power. The Bishop of Rome, known as the Pope, literally Papa or Father of the Church, stood at the top of the church hierarchy and was its supreme leader. And as I said just a moment ago, with the removal of these Roman emperors to Constantinople, the popes were more than just spiritual leaders. They were political leaders, and they attempted to maintain order in Western Europe in the period immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire. Some of the examples that I'll share with you here of great leadership, both spiritual and political leadership, were provided by Pope Leo I, who stepped in 452. This is even before the Roman Empire has collapsed, in an attempt to save the city of Rome from the Huns. Pope Gregory I, who reigned as the Pope from 590 to 604, provided medical and other care to the poor of Rome. Popes enjoyed this sense of power and authority, and they were reluctant to give it up to political authorities. The Bishop of Rome, or Pope, was recognized as the leader of the church, just as the emperor in Rome had been the leader of the empire. And the popes all claimed to be descendants of Simon Peter and claimed control over all Christians based on the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, which some of you will probably remember. I will entrust to you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. These words are known as the Petrine supremacy doctrine, as Peter was considered to be the first bishop or first pope of Rome. All of his descendants, the popes, claimed to be descendants of Simon Peter. So in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Christian church, or Roman Catholic Church, began to experience some problems over theology and doctrine, which almost split the church apart. At this point, the church had to decide that there are some beliefs that are so dangerous to the church that we have to get rid of them and the people who promote these beliefs. A belief that stood out as a challenge to accepted church teachings was called a heresy, and those who practiced it were called heretics. In the 4th and 5th centuries, there were two main heresies that threatened to break the church apart. One was called Arianism, and those who practiced and believed in Arianism believed that Jesus could not be both man and divine, and it was decided in 325 by the Roman Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea that yes, Jesus could be both of those things. He could be both man and God. So it is at the Council of Nicaea in 325 when the Nicene Creed is developed, the idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Many of you probably thought that that was a belief that was intact, already developed when Christianity started, but actually it was not. This was decided upon by the Roman Emperor Constantine and some of his political and religious advisors. Another important heresy of this period was Donatism. Donatism, and practitioners of it, stated that sacraments, that is, marriage, last rites, communion, were worthless if administered by an immoral priest. We should note at this point, when a man or a woman joined the official Catholic Church as a priest, a monk, a nun, or worked his way up to be a bishop, archbishop, or pope, there was a certain moral code expected. For example, anyone who was a monk, nun, priest, bishop, archbishop, or pope was expected to be morally superior to everyone else, didn't drink, didn't gamble, had no sexual activity. Of course, many of you know that to be a member of the Catholic hierarchy, one has to take an oath of celibacy. No sexual activity whatsoever, no marriage, none of that. And that's based on the life of Jesus Christ, who, as far as we know, never married or had any kind of physical relationship with a woman, though there are some today who beg to differ and say possibly that Jesus had been married or interested in Mary Magdalene. So, long story short, what Donatism stated was that if a priest, bishop, archbishop, or monk administered communion at a church service, but he himself was a gambling drunk, was having sex with women, then that communion was worthless. Or if this particular priest had been performing wedding ceremonies, that you were not really married if an immoral priest had conducted the ceremony of marriage. So this was dangerous, of course, to the Catholic Church, so it was deemed a heresy. And just so you know, heresy was taken very seriously in the medieval period. Punishment for heresy could involve execution, being put to death for it, or, more commonly, excommunication, meaning that a person was completely and totally cut off from the church, not allowed to attend or be a part of the church, which effectively meant that a person was a social outcast. There are some very important theologians in this early Christian history that we need to briefly mention. They are St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Benedict, and Venerable Bede. Just briefly, I'll tell you that St. Augustine lived from 354 to 430. His name is also sometimes pronounced St. Augustine. Either way is correct. St. Augustine or St. Augustine had lived a rather complicated life. He grew up in a household where one parent was a pagan, that means non-Christian, and one parent was a devoted Christian, and this led him to be conflicted and torn in his own life. And as a young man, he talked about in his autobiography how he experimented with just about everything, from sex to gambling, and felt that it was somehow wrong. He felt an emptiness, didn't know what was lacking in his life, and then through his mother, he found Jesus Christ and was converted to a Christian. And he read about his experience of conversion in the City of God and in Confessions. In the City of God, Augustine or Augustine talks about how political leaders and spiritual leaders should clean up society and make it a place where Christianity could survive. St. Jerome lived from 348 to 420 and was a great scholar. He was multilingual. He spoke Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and he took the Hebrew version of the Old and New Testament and converted them into Latin. This Latin translation was called the Vulgate, and it was used by the Catholic Church as the Bible until the 1500s, when other versions came along in national languages like English, German, and French. Saint Benedict of Nursia lived from 480 to 547, and his most important contribution was this idea of a moral code for monks, nuns, priests, bishops, archbishops, and popes, and it is called for him the Benedictine Order, or the Rules of Saint Benedict, which stressed a strict set of moral behavior that all those associated with the church as members of the church hierarchy should be physically and mentally pure, abstinent, disdain material possessions. In other words, they should focus on spreading the faith, not in gaining wealth. They also, if they lived in a monastery or a convent, were supposed to take a vow of silence. These rules were put forth in a book in 529 simply called The Rule, and still to this day, St. Benedict's rule impacts the moral and behavioral code of monks, nuns, priests, bishops, and popes. The Venerable Bede wrote an accurate account of early England, which we use to get a lot of information about the earliest history of England, but he's also important because he played a role in developing the BC-AD system of dating that we use in Western civilization. I also want to briefly mention to you St. Patrick, who lived somewhere between 385 and 461, who took Christianity and Roman culture over to Ireland. And, of course, if you know anything about Catholicism at all, you know that still to this day, Irish and Roman Catholicism differ a little bit and sometimes clash over, for example, the proper way to perform sacraments, the proper way to administer monasteries and convents. But St. Patrick today, of course, is the patron saint of Ireland. In other words, the most important religious figure in their history because he brought Christianity to them. At this point, what I want to do is turn to the last topic for this lecture, and those are the Germanic tribes. What we need to briefly mention here is that when the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, all of these native people who had become a part of the Roman Empire were now freed to take back their homelands. So we see a group of people called the Ostrogoths and Lombards who run into Italy and try to take that area away from the Roman Catholic popes who are overseeing it on behalf of the Byzantine emperors. We have the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who were from Denmark rush into England. When the Roman Empire began to decline and fall, orders were given to remove soldiers in England and bring them back to the city of Rome to provide support to that city. When the Roman soldiers pulled out of England, the native people called Celtic Britons seized control of their homeland. But at the same time, since there were no Roman soldiers offering protection to England, these invaders from Denmark called the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes ran into England and attempted to carve out various sections for themselves. So from about 407 to 871 in English history, there are 7 rival kingdoms called the Heptarchy. The Angles have part of England, the Saxons have another part, the Jutes yet another, the Celtic Britons, who were the original inhabitants of England, have some territory that's there. The man who changes all this is Alfred the Great, who was the first king of a unified England. Alfred the Great, in the late 800s, around 870, unifies all of these 7 different kingdoms through a combination of diplomacy and warfare, and brings England together as one strong, unified country under his leadership. In France, or as the Romans called it, Gaul, the Franks or Gauls, the original inhabitants, were also freed from Roman control. When the Roman soldiers pulled out of Gaul, out of France, and went back to Rome, the Gauls seized control of their homeland, and one particular Roman fort became the center of their new kingdom. That Roman fort was Paris. So the Gauls, or the Franks, seized control of Paris, an old Roman fort, made it their political and administrative capital, and began what we know of as France, the Frankish kingdom. The first king of France, or of the Franks, was a man named Clovis. He starts a dynasty of French leaders called the Moravian dynasty. In Spain, the original inhabitants of Spain, called the Visigoths, who also had been responsible for one invasion of the city of Rome in 410, now were freed from Roman control. They took over all of Spain, but they didn't own it long term. Unfortunately for the Visigoths, they gave up essentially Roman domination for a couple of hundred years, and then found themselves a part of the Muslim Empire, which we'll talk about in our next chapter and next lecture. So I know at the end of this lecture you may be thinking, this seems like somewhat of a jumble of ideas and information, and it is. With the fall of Rome, we enter into a period of great instability in the West. Lots of things happen with the fall of Rome. We have these Germanic tribes who seize old Roman territories, their original homelands. At the same time, you have the Byzantine Empire flourishing, attempting to provide some kind of political order and stability by giving orders and aid to the Roman Catholic popes who are trying to oversee the West. But what we're going to see happen in our next lecture is that the Gauls, or the Franks, as we'll now begin to call them, become the most important and most dominant group in Western Europe. And they are going to provide unification and stability to Europe in the early medieval period. So, in our next lecture, we'll talk specifically about the Franks, Clovis, the Moravian dynasty, and an important figure in European history named Charlemagne.